Imagine a world without ink, no handwritten letters, no ancient books, no maps covered with names, no royal orders, no newspapers, no signatures, no records telling us what people bought, sold, owned, believed, or feared. Every story would depend on one thing: human memory. And memory is fragile. A person can remember a story for years, perhaps even for a lifetime, but eventually that person dies. And when the last person who remembers the story is gone, story can disappear with them. Then, thousands of years ago, something incredibly simple changed the fate of human civilization. A dark liquid. A liquid that could leave a mark on a surface and allow a human thought to survive long after the human being who created it was gone. That liquid was ink. Today, ink seems almost too ordinary to notice. We hold a pen, we write a name, we sign a document, we underline a sentence, and then we move on. But behind that tiny black line is one of the longest technological stories in human history. Because before the modern pen, before the fountain pen, before the printing press, before books became cheap, people had to discover how to turn natural materials into something that could carry information. And the first ink makers had no laboratories, no microscopes, no chemical formulas, no modern equipment. They had only what surrounded them: fire, plants, minerals, water, animal products, and their own curiosity. And somewhere in that ancient world, someone discovered that a dark substance could become more than a stain. It could become a message. The story of ink begins there. Long before true writing ink existed, humans were already making marks. Cave walls across different parts of the world preserve evidence of ancient people creating images and symbols with natural pigments. They used charcoal, they used red and yellow ochres, they used minerals and earth. Some marks were painted, some were rubbed onto surfaces, some were probably applied with fingers, sticks, brushes, or other simple tools. These early pigments were important because they proved something fundamental. Humans wanted to leave information outside their own bodies. A picture on a wall could survive longer than a spoken sentence. But painting an image and writing a message were not exactly the same thing. Writing required control. A writer needed to create lines of different thicknesses. They needed a material that could move with a tool. They needed the mark to remain visible. And eventually, they needed a substance that could be stored and transported. That was the challenge. How do you make a liquid that writes? The answer was discovered gradually, and one of the earliest great ink traditions emerged in ancient Egypt. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Egyptians were using black inks made from carbon-based materials. The basic principle was remarkably clever. A black material such as soot could be collected and reduced to very fine particles. Those particles could then be mixed with water and a binding substance. The binder helped the pigment stick to the writing surface. The result was a dark writing medium, sibyle, but revolutionary, because the Egyptians had another extraordinary material to write on: papyrus. Papyrus was made from the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly along the Nile. Strips of the plant were processed and arranged into sheets. Once prepared, the surface could receive writing. A reed pen could be dipped into ink and dragged across the papyrus. A line appeared, then another, and suddenly a human thought had become physical. A name could be recorded. A quantity of grain could be recorded. A tax could be recorded. A religious passage could be recorded. A letter could be written. An instruction could be sent. And perhaps most importantly, a government could keep records. Think about how difficult it would be to administer a large civilization without writing. A ruler needs to know how much food is stored. Officials need to know who owes taxes. Workers need to be organized. Goods need to be counted. Religious institutions need records. Merchants need accounts. Without writing, much of this information has to remain inside someone's memory. But with writing, information can be stored. And ink becomes part of the machinery of civilization. it is easy to think of ink as something artistic. But from the beginning, it was also administrative. It helped civilization count. It helped civilization organize. It helped civilization remember. And the more societies depended on writing, the more important reliable ink became. Ancient ink makers had to solve practical problems. If the pigment particles were too large, the ink might not flow smoothly. If the mixture was too watery, the writing could become weak. If there was too little binder, the pigment might not remain attached. If there was too much binder, the mixture could become difficult to use. These people didn't understand chemistry in the modern sense, but they understood something equally important: experience. They knew what worked, they knew what failed. And knowledge could be passed from one generation to another. Over time, different civilizations developed their own approaches. Across the ancient world, writing appeared on different surfaces: papyrus, parchment, wood, clay, stone, and later, paper. Each surface created different challenges. Ink had to adapt. A mixture that worked beautifully on one surface might behave differently on another. That meant ink was never a single invention. It was a continuing process of experimentation. And one of the most fascinating developments happened far from Egypt. In ancient China, ink developed into a tradition that would eventually become both technology and art. Chinese ink traditions were strongly associated with carbon-based pigments. Soot could be collected and processed into a fine black material. It could be combined with binders and formed into solid ink sticks. Instead of keeping the ink permanently liquid, the solid ink could be stored. When needed, the writer could grind the ink stick against an inkstone with water. The amount of water could be adjusted. The resulting ink could be dark and powerful, or diluted into lighter shades. This gave the writer extraordinary control. And then came the brush. With a brush and ink, writing became something more than the simple recording of words. It became movement. The pressure of the hand mattered. The speed of the stroke mattered. The amount of ink on the brush mattered. The shape of the brush mattered. A writer could create thick black lines, then suddenly produce a delicate, almost transparent stroke. The result was calligraphy. Here, ink was no longer merely carrying information. Ink itself became an artistic language. A single brushstroke could reveal the personality and discipline of the person who created it. This is one of the most beautiful ideas in the history of ink. The substance itself was almost invisible as technology, but the human hand transformed it into expression. And as writing cultures developed, ink became connected with something even more powerful: knowledge, religious teachings, poetry, history, philosophy. Government records, scientific observations, maps, letters, stories, all of them could be preserved through writing, but there was still a major problem. Writing was slow, extremely slow. If you wanted a copy of a book, someone had to write that copy by hand. Every page, every line, every word, every symbol. And that meant written knowledge was expensive. In Europe, one of the most important developments in writing ink was the rise of iron-gall ink. Its ingredients came from a very different world. Instead of simply relying on carbon soot, ink makers could use tannin-rich material known as gallnuts. Gallnuts are growths associated with certain insects and oak trees. They contain large amounts of tannins. When these tannins were combined with iron salts, a chemical reaction produced a dark writing material. A binder such as gum arabic could help the mixture flow and adhere to the writing surface. The resulting ink became enormously important. For centuries, iron-gall ink was used across Europe and other regions for manuscripts, records, correspondence, legal documents, and everyday writing. Imagine a medieval scribe sitting in a dim room. There is almost no artificial light. A candle flickers beside the desk. A parchment lies in front of him. Beside his hand is a small container of ink. He dips his quill. He removes the excess. Then the tip touches the parchment. A black line appears. Another. Pause pass, the writer continues. A page slowly fills, then another, then another. A manuscript that may eventually be considered priceless is being created one stroke at a time, and the ink is doing something extraordinary. It is allowing the words of one generation to reach another. But there was a price. Iron-gall ink could be extremely durable, but some formulations could also become chemically aggressive over time. The same chemical reactions that helped make the writing permanent could eventually contribute to deterioration of the writing surface. Centuries later, conservators would discover something almost tragic. Some historical manuscripts were being damaged by the very ink that had helped preserve them. The words had survived. The page itself could suffer. It was a reminder that every technological solution has consequences. Still, ink continued to spread, and eventually it became deeply connected to the world of books. In medieval Europe, scribes and religious communities copied manuscripts by hand. These books could contain religious texts, classical works, histories, scientific knowledge, poetry, music, and legal material. Some manuscripts were decorated with gold and brilliant pigments. Others were simple working documents. But underneath all of them was the same basic technology: a writing instrument, a surface, and a substance capable of leaving a permanent mark. Ink. For centuries this system worked. But it had a limit. One person could only write so quickly. One scribe could only produce so many pages. One manuscript could only be copied so many times. Human hands were the bottleneck. And then, in the 15th century, that bottleneck was about to be broken. A machine was about to change the relationship between ink and information: the printing press. And when the printing press arrived, ink would face a completely new challenge. It was no longer enough for ink flow to flow from a pen onto parchment. Now ink had to work with a machine. It had to transfer from a printing surface onto paper. It had to produce clear impressions. It had to remain consistent, and it had to do this again and again and again. The world was about to enter an age where one page could become hundreds of pages. One idea could become thousands of copies. One message could travel far beyond its creator. And ink, simple dark substance that began with ancient experiments in soot and natural materials, was about to become the engine of mass communication. The age of handwritten ink was beginning to give way to the age of printed ink, and the consequences would be enormous. Because once humanity learned how to reproduce words quickly, there would be almost no limit to how far those words could travel. Because once humanity learned how to reproduce words quickly, there would be almost no limit to how far those words could travel. And that transformation began with the printing press. Before mechanical printing, a book had to be copied by hand, but a printing press changed the equation. Now a single prepared page could be reproduced again and again, and that created a completely new problem for ink makers. Writing ink was designed to work with a pen. Printing ink had to work with a machine. The ink needed to be thick enough to stay on the printing surface. It needed to transfer cleanly onto paper. It couldn't simply soak away, and it had to produce a sharp impression. The printer needed consistency. If the first page looked clear, but the 100th page looked blurry, the entire process would fail. So printing created a new era of ink technology. In Europe, early printing inks were generally much more viscous than ordinary writing inks. Oils and pigments became important components. The goal was simple: create an ink that would stick to the raised surface of a type block, then transfer onto paper, without spreading uncontrollably. This might sound like a small technical improvement. It wasn't, because the right ink helped make mass printing possible. Suddenly, a workshop could produce page after page. A printer could set type once, apply ink, press the paper, lift it, and repeat the process. One sheet became dozens became hundreds, and eventually thousands. For the first time, written information could move through society at a speed that handwritten copying could never match. Books became more accessible. Pamphlets spread. Religious arguments traveled. Political ideas circulated. Scientific observations could be reproduced. Maps could be distributed. And ordinary people began encountering printed information in ways their ancestors never had. Ink had crossed a major threshold. It was no longer simply preserving knowledge. It was multiplying knowledge. And that distinction changed history. Think about a single idea. Before mass printing, an idea might exist in the mind of a scholar. Perhaps it would be written into a manuscript. Perhaps a few copies would be made. But the number of people who could encounter it was limited. Printing changed that. Now one text could reach thousands. The words could cross cities, then countries, then continents. The technology of ink had become part of the technology of mass communication. But printing continued to evolve. As newspapers grew in importance, printers needed enormous quantities of ink, and newspapers created a new challenge: speed. A newspaper couldn't take days to print. People wanted current information. Politics, wars, markets, advertisements, accidents, events. The faster printing became, the more efficiently ink had to work. The 19th century brought enormous changes. Industrialization transformed manufacturing. Factories replaced many small-scale workshops. Machines became faster. Printing presses became larger and more powerful. Paper production increased. And ink manufacturing became increasingly industrial. Instead of relying entirely on individual craftsmen mixing small batches, manufacturers could produce ink on a much larger scale. Different pigments and dyes were developed. New chemical processes expanded the range of available colors. Black ink remained essential. Suddenly, the world could become much more colorful. Posters, advertisements, packaging, illustrations, maps, books, labels, magazines. Color printing created an entirely new visual culture, and behind every colorful image was a complicated problem. How do different inks interact? How do colors combine? How quickly should they dry? How strongly should they adhere? How can the image remain stable? These questions pushed ink technology forward, but the biggest changes were not only happening in printing. Writing itself was changing. For centuries, people had relied on quills. A feather had to be prepared. The tip had to be shaped. The writer had to keep dipping it into ink. It worked. It was inconvenient. Then came metal nibs. Metal pens could be manufactured more consistently than individual feather quills. They were durable, they could produce controlled strokes, and they could be paired with manufactured writing inks. But there was still one major inconvenience. You had to keep dipping the pen into an ink bottle. Then inventors began looking for a solution. What if the ink could travel inside the pen? That idea eventually led to the fountain pen. The fountain pen was not simply a pen with a reservoir. It required careful control. Ink had to flow when the writer needed it, and not leak everywhere when the pen was moved. Air had to enter the reservoir as ink left it. The feed system had to regulate the flow. The nib had to deliver the ink smoothly. It sounds simple, but it took considerable engineering, and when fountain pens became practical, writing changed again. People could carry their ink with them. A writer no longer needed an open ink bottle beside every page. The pen itself became a small ink storage system for writers, students, business people, officials, and travelers. This was a major improvement. But the story wasn't finished, because the 20th century would produce an even more important transformation. The ballpoint pen. Instead of using a traditional nib, a ballpoint pen uses a tiny rotating ball. As the ball moves across the paper, it picks up ink from an internal reservoir and transfers it onto the surface. This sounds almost ridiculously simple, but that tiny ball solved a major problem. It allowed ink to be delivered in a controlled way while keeping the reservoir largely sealed. The result was cheap, portable, fast, and convenient. And then something remarkable happened. Ink stopped being something people thought about. it became invisible technology. Millions of people could carry a pen in their pocket without thinking about the thousands of years of experimentation behind it. But while writing instruments were changing, printing technology was changing even faster. Newspapers expanded. Magazines became popular, commercial advertising exploded, packaging became increasingly important. Companies needed labels, products needed instructions, governments needed forms, banks needed documents, schools needed textbooks, and every one of these systems depended on ink. Then came the age of color printing. Different technologies allowed printers to combine several inks to reproduce an enormous range of colors. This changed advertising forever. A product could now be presented visually. A poster could attract attention from across a street. A magazine could use color to create emotion. A package could become recognizable simply because of its design. Ink had become part of branding, and eventually ink moved beyond paper. It began appearing on packaging materials: plastic, metal, dust, glass, fabric, industrial products, labs, electronics. The definition of ink became much broader. It was no longer simply the black liquid used by a writer. It became a family of specialized materials designed to place information, images, markings, and colors onto different surfaces. And then another revolution arrived: the computer. At first, computers seemed like the end of ink. If information could exist digitally, why print it? For a moment, it looked as though paper and ink might slowly disappear. But instead, something unexpected happened. Digital technology created new forms of printing. Inkjet printers could create images by placing microscopic droplets of ink onto paper. Instead of a traditional printing plate, the printer could receive digital information directly. A photograph could be printed. A document could be printed: a chart, a poster, a label, a personal letter. The process could happen inside a machine sitting on a desk. Ink had entered the digital age. But even this was only one part of the story, because ink today is used for purposes most ancient ink makers could never have imagined. Look at a banknote. Its designs and markings are not simply decoration. Specialized inks can be used as part of security systems. Look at a passport. Look at product packaging. Look at a barcode. Look at medicine packaging. Look at a newspaper. Look at a shipping label. Look at the clothes people wear. Ink is everywhere. And there is another fascinating use. Ink can even become part of the human body. Tattooing is an ancient practice with roots extending thousands of years into the past. Modern tattoo inks are very different from ancient pigments and mixtures, but the fundamental concept remains familiar. A pigment is placed into the skin to create a lasting mark. Again, humans are using color to preserve identity, meaning, memory, or expression. From ancient manuscripts to modern tattoos, basic human desire is surprisingly similar. We want marks to remain. We want something to last. And that may be the deepest reason ink became so important. Human beings are temporary. Our voices disappear. Our memories fade. Our lives end. But a mark can remain. A signature can survive its writer. A letter can survive the person who sent it. A book can survive its author. A map can survive the traveler who drew it. A manuscript can survive the civilization that created it. That is the real power of ink. It gives human thought a physical life. But there is another side to this story. Ink doesn't only preserve truth, it can preserve lies. A forged signature can deceive. A false document can change someone's life. A piece of propaganda can influence millions. A printed lie can travel just as efficiently as a printed fact. The printing press didn't automatically make humanity wiser. It simply made information more powerful. And ink became one of the tools through which that power moved. This is why the history of ink is also a history of influence. Whoever controls writing can influence what people remember. Whoever controls printing can influence what people read. Whoever controls information can influence society. And yet, despite all these changes, the basic idea has remained remarkably constant. A substance is placed on a surface. The substance creates a mark. The mark carries information. And the information travels through time. Thousands of years ago, that mark might have been created with soot and a reed pen. Centuries later, it might have been iron-gall ink and a quill, then oil-based printing ink and a press, then fountain pen ink, then ballpoint ink, then microscopic droplets from an inkjet printer. The technology changed, the chemistry changed, the tools changed, but the purpose remained: to make something invisible, visible. A thought begins inside a human mind. It has no physical shape. It cannot be touched. It cannot be held. Then the writer moves a pen. A line appears. And suddenly, thought exists outside the mind. Another person can see it. Another person can understand it. Another person can copy it. Another generation can preserve it. And centuries later, someone can discover it. That is why the history of ink is not really about bottles, pens, pigments, or chemistry. It is about memory. It is about communication. It is about civilization's ability to speak across time. Think about the ancient scribe again, sitting in a dim room, a small container of ink beside him, a writing tool in his hand. He makes a mark. Perhaps he doesn't know who will eventually see it. Perhaps he doesn't know whether the page will survive. Perhaps he doesn't even imagine that people thousands of years later might study his words. But he writes anyway. And because that mark survives, we can hear an echo of his world. We can understand what people ate, what they traded, what they believed, how they governed, what they feared, what they loved, what they knew, and what they didn't know, all because someone once decided to leave a mark. That is the extraordinary journey of ink. It began with natural materials. It evolved through thousands of experiments. It helped build writing systems. It supported governments and religions. It preserved literature. It helped spread science. It transformed printing. It fueled newspapers. It entered factories. It moved into pens. It entered the digital age. And even now, in a world dominated by smartphones and screens, ink refuses to disappear. Because screens can show information, and ink can preserve it physically. A digital message can vanish when a device fails. A handwritten letter can sit inside a box for generations. A digital photograph can be deleted instantly. A printed photograph can survive in an old family album. A web page can disappear. A book can remain on a shelf for centuries. And perhaps that is why ink still feels different. There is something powerful about seeing a physical mark made by another human hand. The pressure of the pen, the shape of the letters, the small imperfections, the places where the ink became darker, the places where the writer paused. A handwritten page can carry not only words, and evidence of the person who wrote them. The ink becomes part of the story. So the next time you pick up a pen, don't think of it as an ordinary object. Think about the journey behind it. Think about the ancient person collecting soot, the Egyptian scribe writing on papyrus, the Chinese calligrapher grinding an ink stick, the medieval monk dipping a quill into iron-gall ink, the printer rolling ink across a press, the industrial worker producing thousands of bottles, the inventor designing a fountain pen, the engineer creating a ballpoint, the modern machine releasing microscopic droplets onto paper. All of them are connected. Different centuries, different civilizations, different technologies. But one basic human idea: we want our thoughts to remain. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement of ink. Not that it created beautiful letters, not that it made books possible, not even that it transformed printing. Its greatest achievement was much simpler. Ink gave human beings a way to leave their memory behind. A civilization can disappear. A language can change. A kingdom can collapse. A city can be buried. A person can die. But somewhere, on a piece of papyrus, on parchment, on paper, on a wall, or inside an old book, a tiny mark may remain. And if someone finds that mark, and can understand it, past speaks again. That is the true history of ink. A story that began with darkness and ended by helping humanity create a permanent record of itself. From a tiny drop of black pigment to the written memory of entire civilizations, ink may look ordinary, but human history is covered in it. And perhaps every time we write something down, we are doing the same thing humans have been doing for thousands of years. We are telling the future, I was here. And that tiny message may be one of the most powerful things humanity has